One of the hardest things to do in the beginning as an artist when you're building your skills is to figure out whether or not you're actually improving in the first place. This inability to tell whether or not we're actually improving is, I think, to a certain degree part of the artistic experience. It's also something that often causes students and people who are aspiring artists to, quite frankly, give up and feel really lost and disillusioned with the process. Art is one of these things that takes a long time to perfect. It's a very old style of skill. You need to get good at a huge number of things. And there's a huge number of things that you can improve, from perspective to fundamentals, rendering. You can get better at composition, at your creativity, at just getting better at coming up with ideas, at your process. You can get better at productivity, but none of this matters if you can't really figure out whether or not any of it is actually improving. One of the best solutions to this is actually pretty simple. You can track your progress. And I think this is a great way to figure out where you are on your artistic journey, whether you're improving, whether you're going in the right direction. And it's also a good way to look back at where you have been to remind yourself that yes, you are improving. Without tracking, it is very tricky to actually do this properly. So what I want to do in this episode is really look at how we can track our progress as artists. Most importantly is how we make sure that we do this visually. And there's a couple of frameworks that I'll share with you, lots of different options for how you might handle this. But while this is a simple idea, we're just collecting images and making sure that we look at them so we can see whether we're getting better or not. I think there's a number of ways that I'm going to share with you where we can really look deeper at this and have some ways where this will really help you early on when it's so hard to tell whether you're making any progress at all. A lot of your drawings just kind of suck and you don't really know what to do about it. But also, if you're 20 years or 30 years into your career, I think if you make this a habit, there's a lot of really important insight you can have to your overall development as an artist, your stylistic progression, what's working, what's not. And I found this immensely useful over my life and over my career. Welcome to the Visual Scholar Podcast. My name is Tim Mcburnie. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this show, we're all about demystifying the worlds of art, creativity, and productivity so that you can get better faster and enjoy your artistic journey. All right, so this is both a really simple idea. We're just going to collect a bunch of our images, and there's a number of ways that we can do this, and I'm going to share with you and unpack how you can go about this. And I think there's good ideas for how we do this. There's good ways and there's bad ways. And some of the really simple ways can often actually be the most effective over the long term. Because remember, a big part of this is setting up this habit to take you over a long period of your career. This is something I actually stumbled upon really early on, where essentially what I had is all my outbound images and basically everything I sent to people on the internet, I just collected it in a single folder. And I'm just kind of lazy, so I never made different folders. And I just noticed that as this folder grew, I was able to scroll back through it and sort of look at what I'd done that year, look at what I did a few years before that. And what I noticed is that over time, I could sort of observe this folder and actually kind of read it, right? Like a book, like tea leaves, right? It had extra information in there. And I found this a really, really useful thing. Now, this is obviously something where if you haven't been doing this for the last 20 years, you can go back and collect things. And I'm going to talk about some of the better habits you can form around this. The way I've done it is not necessarily the best. I'm always sort of trying to develop this and formalize this a little bit more. That's why I'm kind of making this particular video, to really dig deep and look at this concept. But I found that this is one of these things that often we don't do in the beginning. Often students really struggle to tell whether or not they're getting better. And as a teacher, I can often say, no, you're getting better. But for them, it's hard to tell. And I have found that this concept of tracking is one of the best ways to actually get them to understand that they are improving. So hopefully that's something you can appreciate, that part of fundamentally the artistic experience is it's hard for us to tell where we're at. It's often easier for other people to tell, and often a good teacher will be able to not just tell that you are progressing, they'll be able to, read those tea leaves as well and look at your work and say, hey, you just need to keep going a little bit more in this direction, improve these things, and you'll kind of find that it'll work out. So that's good if you have a really good mentor, but often I certainly didn't have a lot of people who were looking over me in the beginning, and you may be the same. So this is kind of the next best thing, where you can build some structure and a formalized way of being able to sort of look at your work a little bit more fresh and get some extra insight. Again, read the tea leaves of the chaos of your creation. So anyway, it's a really simple concept. What I'm going to do is firstly just look at what this is, right? Like what the idea of tracking is, and just unpack a few of those things I was just talking about why I think we're not good at this. Secondly, I'll look at the practical ideas of how you actually do this, right? Do you use a blog? Do you use a folder? Can you use social media for this? What are the best practices here? What are some things that certainly have worked for me? What are the things that I tend to avoid? And lastly, I'm going to look at how we use this, right? So how you can read the tea leaves at different areas of your career. And again, this is something where I found this super useful at particular points in my career to really readjust and reframe and sort of remind myself of who I am as an artist. So lots of ways we can use this. And again, my goal is just to try and unpack this issue a bit. So obviously it's something you can understand, but I think if you can really make a good formalized habit out of creating a sort of tracking folder or some way that you can actually observe your production as an artist, I think it can really, really help. So firstly, what is the idea of tracking your progress? This is really where, when often I'm running courses, and I've learned to do this from teaching very large classes of people, often when I was teaching at the concept design workshop a lot, we would have 100 people who are coming in first year. They're doing their boot camp. They're really figuring out, is this career right for them? And this is one of the things where we'd sort of notice that at the end of the year, people would feel really down. They had made a lot of progress, but often when we're making progress through studying fundamentals or trying to do some sort of abstract study, it's often a mix of things. And often you don't necessarily always even improve in a linear fashion. You're often going up or down. You might learn something new about perspective. You might learn something new about anatomy, but then applying that to your own work and figuring out how it's actually going to work, shaking it out, right? Like really sort of figuring out how it actually applies to you is another matter. So often you can learn some stuff, you can feel really good, you try and apply it, maybe that doesn't work. You can also go on bad tangents, where you kind of really try and learn to do something and turns out it wasn't really what you wanted to do, and it feels like a massive waste of time. But overall, what we would find is that most people did improve. And when we looked at, okay, let's take like the first thing you did on the first day you came to class, and then let's look at the best thing you did this year. Like, what's the difference? Let's look at the worst thing you did versus the best thing. And, let's look at the worst thing you did in the first week of class versus the worst thing you did in the last sort of week of the year, right? So different ways you can compare your work, right? And again, they see different things about how you're progressing. But I think just having this information in general, what we kind of noticed is like people would be genuinely shocked because what they're seeing does not mirror their lived experience of whether or not they're improving. So the tracking and having a tracking habit, or I like to sort of think of it as like a physical thing. We're collecting our images somewhere. We want a really easy way to go, okay, I'm going to go check. And you know where to go check. It's easy for you to go check. And you can just quickly go and actually do this. It's no good if you just have to do some deep dive and search through 1 million folders on 5 different computers, whether you have to go and find a bunch of sketchbooks. You really want a way that is an action, right? Think of this idea of having a tracking device. And this is something you actually need to build and keep with you. It can be very simple, but nevertheless, I think it's something you need to build and maintain. So this is a way of seeing where you've been and looking essentially at your history of your artistic progress, of your artistic journey. and having a formalized way of doing that. Now, the reason I think that often people's lived experience of whether or not they're improving is not matching up with reality, right? Often, for better or worse, sometimes we can think we're doing really good and you kind of step back and maybe we're not. Like it's just that we're so enmeshed in the current feeling. And I think this is fundamentally because of the way that humans just adapt. We're very good at adapting to our environment. We're very good at whatever's happening right now is essentially part of our sort of thermometer, right, for the world, our sort of gauge. That just becomes normal. Wherever you're at right now for your art is what feels normal. And there's always somewhere to go next where you can see, as your work gets better, you can see more deficiencies. And I think this is just fundamentally part of being an artist. If you're imagining there's some point where you get to some fabled pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, some amazing destination where finally you don't think that your art is bad. Now, that's not to say that the way that, for instance, I viewed my work when I was just starting out is exactly the same as the way I view it now. I think I get a lot more pleasure from creating art now that I have competency, now that I can sort of create the images in my head. There is a feeling of like, look, everything I'm doing doesn't suck, but there is still a feeling of, oh man, I still have so far to go. I still see lots of problems in my work, and these problems seem obvious to me. And this is something that I've noticed as I've sort of progressed. The best way I can kind of explain it is that when I was just starting out, like and I'll use the frame of comic books as just a really simple example. I would be reading comic books and I was 13, 14, 15, 16. I think that's when I really just started to figure out like, oh, okay, I kind of want to do this a bit more. I don't really have any memory of deciding that I wanted to become a professional artist. It's not really how my brain worked. I don't know why, but I was sort of interested in this. And when I was at that early age, right, you're 14, 15, every professional comic book artist seemed like they had good anatomy. Everyone seemed like they knew where the muscles went. And the general advice was, hey, everyone needs to learn anatomy. And even people who, now that I look at their work and I'm like, that anatomy's not that good, based like compared to how good anatomy can be. If you look at the artists that I now know, maybe not necessarily comic book artists, but just artists who have a really solid understanding of where every single muscle inserts and how it all functions, a deep like medical grade level of anatomy, I'm like, none of that was very good. Like none of the artists I was looking at when I was 14 and I thought they all knew anatomy, none of them had very good anatomy. Very, very few of them had good anatomy. It was good enough, but there was a really sort of simple way that I just looked at everyone and I thought, hey, I can see that, they can draw muscles. They can do these things. They must know anatomy. And as I got better and better, I kind of noticed that, look, I could see the flaws. I could see the flaws in their art. I could see more flaws in my art. And I guess just as my understanding of anatomy increased, the way that I was able to be critical of where, someone was drawing a deltoid or a bicep, and you could kind of see whether or not they actually knew where that went, right? There's like, they kind of roughly know where these muscles go. And then the better you get at understanding it, and this is not to say that I'm a master anatomy artist, but you get better at spotting mistakes, both in your work and in other people's work. So this is something where the level, as I was saying, always increases. You always get better at spotting mistakes in your work and other people's work and just, how things are meant to function. It's exactly the same with perspective. I always imagine every comic book artist is a professional artist. They all knew perfect perspective and they always talk about everyone needs to know his perspective. But again, the more I learn about perspective, the more I'd kind of look at that and I'd be like, that's not right. It looks okay, but I'm like, but that's not technically accurate. That's not all going to the right vanishing point. They're just kind of making stuff up. And again, this is just part of the artistic experience, essentially, that as you progress, you gain more understanding and knowledge, you become more critical of your work, obviously, because you can just see some of those little mistakes there. So I think this is this is a long way to go, but I think it's very natural, and it is just part of the artistic experience that as you progress, you see more and more mistakes in your own work. And this makes it really hard to actually get a good sense of how good you are, obviously, because you're always probably going to feel like my anatomy could be better. My perspective could be better. It's just a fundamental way of how we work. We're very good at adapting, and we're very good at feeling. Again, if you're someone who has improved, you probably have that bug where you say, oh, my anatomy could be better, so I'm going to try and learn more and make it better. And there's all likelihood that no matter where you are in your art journey, you're having those feelings. So fundamentally, the feeling doesn't change in us that we need to improve, that we can spot mistakes, that we're always, the better you get, the more you see of what is possible. And the more you see how really great art, you see how tricky it is. When people start out painting, they kind of think, oh yeah, you could like got this artist and this artist. And then all of the high level painters that, I know would all be talking about someone like John Singer Sargent, and everyone's like, oh yeah, Sargent. And I think when you're younger, it's easy to kind of say, oh, here's like some artist who I kind of like, who's drawing comics or doing something that I kind of like. And I'm like, they're a really good painter. And everyone's like, yeah, but you should look at Sargent because Sargent's really good. And I'm like, it's all the same, right? And then you kind of look at what Sargent was doing, where he's literally loading multiple colors on a brush so that he can, do one stroke and get like multiple things happening. And you see the complexity of how it looks easy, right? Often it looks easy and effortless when people are really, really good. But when you try and do the same thing, you realize how far away from that we are. So the better you get, often the more you feel like you don't really know anything. So anyway, it's a long way to go, but this feeling persists. That's my point of trying to unpack this idea. Is this idea of always feeling as if you need to improve will persist, hopefully, ideally, in a perfect world, forever. So the idea of tracking is to counterbalance this. If you have a history of where you've been, what you find is when you actually look at this, it kind of breaks that spell. We're in the moment, but when we look at our artistic progress through this framework of linear time, or just looking at different projects we've done, it can actually sort of snap us out of that to a certain degree. When I've looked at comics that I've created 10 years ago, 15 years ago, like these sort of really old projects that I've completed, I'm able to observe them a little bit more sort of technically, right? I'm actually able to see what they are. And I think this is where you get to see things more as a viewer, more as someone who is actually going to be buying or consuming or looking at your work and looking at like, what do they actually like? Because so often we're concerned with the minutiae of technicality and process. As I said, we're trying to improve all of these things. And hopefully through doing that, we're creating better work. But really, often what people do actually respond to is the emotional side of things. The story we're telling, the narrative, the ideas behind our art, how the characters feel. And often I think it can be easy to lose sight of that, to lose track of that at different times in your career. Either way, there's an infinite number of ways that we can lose our way or emotionally lose our way because it feels like we're not getting anywhere. And having some way to track is just the antidote to this. And I think there's a number of like key things that are actually really important about tracking that, again, I'll unpack a little bit more in the takeaways, but fundamentally what we're trying to do is just get a history, a way for us to break that spell that we have as artists, that we're always here and we don't see that we are going to get better. That's the other thing, is it's not just where have I been? Let's feel good about myself. But you can see a pace, you can see a progress, you can see how you are getting better over a year. And you can assume that, look, if I keep doing what I'm doing, it's going to work. I'll get there in the end. Things will get better. The things that I'm doing right now are working. So this is helpful in many ways to break this spell of always feeling like we're no good. Okay, so how do you actually do this? It's really simple. You just collect in relatively high resolution a JPEG version of everything you've done. You don't need to have some way to find all the originals, but I think it is good if you're working digitally or traditionally to have some easy way to collect all of these things. So I think just having a JPEG, just a high quality but compressed version of what you have created is worthwhile. And this could be a matter of taking a bunch of photos of a sketchbook. If you do work traditionally, again, taking good reproductions of those. Obviously, you could, if you have a real solid sketchbook game, you could line all of your sketchbooks up in linear fashion on a shelf. I think that's a good parable of this, but I think something that's easier to access, that you can access anywhere, anytime, is much better. So I really like the idea of a JPEG, high res, relatively high quality, something that you'd be happy to share, and you just want to record these in some way, shape, or form. Now, there's a couple of different ways you can obviously do this, right? You can look at having this on your computer. This could be on a phone, right? Could be an album in your sort of Photos app on your phone. It could just be like a Dropbox folder or some kind of file sharing folder. You could also, and this is where I think it's interesting to look at the different ways we could do this. You could have a blog, Instagram, Facebook, like you could do this kind of thing on ArtStation. Now, I think this is often where people get a little bit into the weeds on it, and we obsess over how and why we're doing this. I think that there's a number of ways we can view this idea of tracking. Like, it is good in general to track and put things out publicly. So I think, for instance, if you are just beginning, often artists don't want to put their art out into the world. You don't want to have an ArtStation. You don't want to have an Instagram account. And often what we say is just put it up anyway. And this is as advice to students who are going through first or second year of a university/college degree on entertainment design. Just make one anyway. You can always delete it. You can always delete your old work, the history of your Instagram. You can start afresh. You can certainly do that with your ArtStation. Just delete a whole bunch of stuff, put it in an old folder, start a new one. I think that if you're looking at this from that sort of professional thing of like, I don't want to put bad work on the internet, just understand that when you submit something as a folio or you're pitching your work in some way, you're going to be able to present a very clean, concise folio. And if people can see that you're progressing, that's good. Every artist, every art director, everyone who's going to be hiring you in some way, shape, or form knows that there is a process to getting better, and that earlier on you're going to suck. It's not the worst thing. If you're beginning and you're kind of worried about that, people being able to see your progress and how much you're improving is a good thing, right? So don't worry too much about like, I don't want to put it out into the world. But what I would say is that although Instagram and blogs, ArtStations, all these things are good, I think they're a little bit separate to this idea that I'm talking about. And the reason for that is I've had a lot of blogs over the years. I haven't been that good at posting on them all the time, but back in the early 2000s, blogs were really, and making your own blog on your website, that was how you kind of promoted your work. And I had a lot of these, and they're all gone. Like every single one of them is gone. Every single way that probably I put my work on the internet pre-2010, certainly pre-2008, is gone. We had things like CG Hub. CG Hub died. I had a bunch of work on that. And I also had a bunch of work on a whole bunch of different blogs, and it's all gone, right? It's not on the internet anymore. So I think you do have to kind of have a centralized way that you're doing this for yourself. And I think that the simplest way to do this is just with a basic folder on a computer. I know this sounds really old school. If you can put it on Dropbox or a file sharing site, I think that's good. Again, one that you have access to. Doesn't need to be something. This is not for other people. I think that is the best way. The folder that I kind of had that really sort of started off this as an idea that, made me kind of want to always suggest it in every sort of class and course that I run, is just a folder, and it's literally called Sent. It's just every image that I would have to send to a client, or when I'd post it to my blog, I had to save a JPEG of it from Photoshop. That went in a folder, and I just put all that there. And every decade, there gets to be too many images in there, and I just make a new one, right? So I have this record going back to probably 2008, 2000, right, is kind of when I started doing this. And it's quite easy to maintain and back up a folder like that. It's just full of JPEGs. It's not going to get that big. You can easily put it on a thumb drive. You can back it up really easily, right? You can transfer it from one computer to another. It's not something where you have to put a lot of effort into making sure that, if your computer crashes or you sort of lose that data, that sort of folder goes away. It's small enough that there's many, many different ways you can sort of back it up and make sure it's safe, let's say. So I certainly had no trouble with that over the years. If you put it on a site like Dropbox, which again is just what I use, but Dropbox is a bit antiquated these days. I'm sure there's other sort of better options. Then you can kind of access it from anywhere. And I think that is really handy for a lot of reasons we'll sort of talk about. So all this needs to be is just a record. And I think linear is a good way where you can sort it by date and literally just scroll through all the things that you've made. I think that is the best thing to do. It sounds really simple, but there's nothing to it. That is the most valuable version of this that I think you can find. Now, there are reasons to maybe have this as an Instagram account that might be an easier way for you to back things up, depending on sort of where you're at, whether or not you have a whole bunch of computers lying around your sort of studio, or maybe you're a little bit more. I know a lot of people who are sort of younger these days are mainly based on an iPad or something like that. So it might be a little bit harder for you to save these things and just have them as folders. So in that case, again, having an Instagram account or something like that may be a way to do this. But just remember that Instagram will go away. All these things will go away. A folder on your computer tends to just survive. It's survived every sort of nuclear explosion and sort of destruction of online content. It's just a stupid, silly little folder that I have on my computer. This might be something that you have to put a little bit of effort into maintaining. It might be something where every month or every 6 months you kind of collect all the images that you've kind of posted, put everything that you really want to sort of keep, and just transfer it into a folder somewhere that you can access. We'll also talk about how there are ways that you can organize this. So if you want to go deeper, then go deeper. You could potentially organize this and have extra folders in there for different projects or early work or whatever. But all I'm saying is that at its most basic level, I kind of save everything that I put out into the world and I just put it in a folder and I dump it in there and I put zero effort into organizing it. It's still very, very valuable. The fundamental trait that this needs to have is longevity and ease of use. Those are the two things that I think are the most important. If you're kind of thinking about this, because I know a lot of people do obsess over, but how am I going to do this? And it's hard to kind of start doing this. But the two things I think are the most important, they may not seem that important right now, is, as I said, longevity, right? Is this thing bomb-proof? Is it going to die if someone pulls the plug on a server somewhere and, some internet site goes out of business? And is it easy for you to do? Whatever's easiest for you to collate and collect, that's what you need to do. And again, it may seem like, I can put it here, I can put it there, but trust me, from my experience over 20, 30 years kind of doing this stuff, that, a lot of this stuff disappears. And if you can have stuff that's old, so for instance, I don't have a lot of the images that are kind of I think sort of 2001. And there's probably a bunch of images there that would be good to have because I could just go look at them, but they're not easily accessible. And that's, again, something that I'm going to do as part of this exercise, is sort of refresh my own collection of this, maybe collate it a bit better. And again, I'll report back and sort of, check back and let you guys know how that kind of has progressed and, how that has improved my sort of experience of this. But mine is just super, super basic. And I think that's all you need. All right. How do you use this? Like, what is the point? There's a couple of things here that I think are worth understanding. Firstly, just tracking progress and measuring progress, just tracking where you are, tracking where you've been, is one of the best ways to improve. It's hard to know why, but I think it has been proven that this is a good way to improve a lot of different metrics. Just tracking your progress with, athletic abilities or weight loss abilities or sort of diet abilities is a good way to really change your behavior. So this is one of the things they say is if you literally just keep a food diary, you will probably eat better, because when you go to eat the thing that maybe you're not trying to eat, and you have to write it down, that means that you're probably not going to do it. And when you actually see it and you look at it, I think it just naturally changes the way that we view what we're doing. And it's a lot harder for us to make up stories about what we are doing because you can see it. It's measurable. You're looking at the numbers, right? Is this going up? Is it going down? Am I running faster or slower, right? What am I doing differently? You can see it. And I think just tracking it, measuring it has been proven to make a huge difference in some weird sort of subconscious ways. Like people don't actually consciously do anything different. You just track and measure, and then that metric will improve in the way and the direction that you want to improve. So there's a little bit of kind of human subconscious nonsense going on there, but fundamentally just tracking is a great way to improve your ability. And I think this is one of the things that can really help your learning in general. So that's the first level, is like, if you just do this, it will, I think, tend to help. Even if you put in zero effort, or even if you don't, maybe even if you don't even look at it that much, I think just having it there will sort of help. So the second thing is, when you are really in the beginning, when you're really starting out, it's so hard to tell whether you're making any progress at all, because you're often looking at bad drawings versus bad drawings. They're all not where you want to be. The trick is to know, are the things that I'm doing working? Am I improving? If you know that you're improving, if you take, for example, you do this for 6 months, you do this for a year, you do this for a month, I think you can actually notice some differences in even a short amount of time. We'll kind of like unpack that a little bit. But if you just sort of look at that difference, right? Like, hey, here's my bad drawings here, and here's my bad drawings there. I think you can often see that like there are improvements when you look at them side by side. If you just look at both image, right? Here's maybe some life drawing you're doing. Maybe you're trying to improve your ability to perceive what you're seeing and just kind of understand spatial stuff, maybe learn some anatomy, whatever you want to get from doing life drawing from live models. You will probably see that like, both of these images that I did 6 months apart when you're just starting out are not the best. You can see mistakes in them. When you put them together, though, we start to compare. And it is our natural ability to compare that instantly will change the way you view these. And you will see like, oh, this is better than that. It may just be simple things. It may be that the figure's not actually drawn that much better, but you're actually fitting most of the figure on the page now. You are starting to be able to do it. Your lines are loosening up a little bit. Whatever it is, you start to see this progress. And when you say, okay, I've been doing this for a month, I've been doing this for 6 months, this is how much progress I made, you can do one of two things. One, you can say, well, I'm improving. That makes me feel good. And I know that if I keep doing what I've been doing, I'll probably improve to a similar degree over a similar period of time. And then you can get some feeling of reliability here, that like this is just something where you put in effort and you get out a result. In the beginning, it's really hard to see the result, but when you see comparisons, it becomes easier to see the progress. Secondly, there you may say, I really need to step things up because I'm not improving as fast as I want. If I extrapolate out this progress and say, if I work for another 5 years, I just still don't think I'm going to get there. Maybe I need to put a little bit more effort in. Whatever it is, this gives you that insight. And I think just seeing that gives you that motivation because it tells you where you're at. So I think in the beginning, it can be really, really important to do this and do this regularly because you will be improving quickly, but you're often not able to see it. As a teacher, this is one of these things where I can often see. I'm seeing like, no, you're getting a lot better. Like you remember you weren't doing that? And they're like, no, I don't remember that. And I'm like, okay, let's go get the page, right? Let's get the old life drawing. Let's get the old time where you tried to, render a cube. And people will often be doing this, right? Rendering a cube is a great example. It's one of the fundamental things we would always do in boot camp. And I think your ability to render a cube increases with your general ability. So someone who's a better renderer, someone like, the esteemed Craig Mullins, who's like known for having really good fundamentals, his cube rendered from his imagination is better than mine. Why it's better than mine, I don't really know, because he's doing things that are above my sort of knowledge, even though I know all the things he's doing. Even though I can explain it, I can teach it, because he's had so much more experience than that. His is going to be better than mine. And someone who is just starting out, their cube is going to be a lot worse than someone who's done a year of rendering. And there'll be a number of things that are going into this, is your ability to just control your materials, your ability to understand the basic components of light, the shadow, your reflected light, your ambient occlusion, your fill light, all of these concepts. As you improve your ability to remember all those, to put them in, to figure out how your tool works, everything will improve. But often in the beginning, a lot of what's improving is just basic tool use. People understand in Photoshop how to make a selection, how to use a brush that's not just the airbrush or something. And you'll see these massive improvements. And it's only when you go back and look in that first one that people really see, like, oh, yeah, look, I made some improvement. So I think in the beginning, it's just so important to do this. You will see and notice a massive difference, I think, even over short periods of time. So in the beginning, I think that's sort of useful. I think another really good use for this, like reading the tea leaves, is where this is something I often make as part of, and I kind of talked about this in a previous episode of the Visual Scholar podcast, where you're trying to kind of refresh your memory of who you are, right, as an artist, and sort of get back into the flow of drawing. If you have this record of where you've been as an artist, it's a really good way to get a clear picture of a couple of things. One is just that you have made progress, you are getting better. These are the things that you've done. And that means that when you jump in the first time, often it's a little bit stiff, you're a little bit rough. You have that confidence that you are improving, that even if you jump in and things are not going well, your drawing sucks, it's okay, because this is part of a process. I have gotten better. Things are moving in a good direction. So it gives you a good sense of that, right? Of kind of like who you are when you're trying to, again, sort of get back on the wagon of drawing, right? It reminds you who you are. But also I think it's really good to just have this to kind of scroll through, maybe less so like the linear aspect of it, but maybe just you look at the top layer of it, the last, chunk of things you did. Often when we take a break from drawing, or if you're getting a little bit frustrated, often it can be because you're looking at art books, you're looking at all these cool inspirational things, and we forget to look at ourselves. So if you look at a whole bunch of really high quality, amazing art, you're like, oh, this is good. I want to do this. I want to do that. This is going to be great. Yeah, amazing, blah, blah, blah. And then you go and try and draw something, and it just doesn't turn out how you imagined, because you thought you were looking at all this great art and maybe you did some study, but then you go and it just looks completely different. I think this is often because we've got a lot of other stuff in our head, but we're not connected to who we are as an artist. What does it actually likely to look like if you create this stuff? Looking at your own work, I think this sounds really, when I say it, this sounds like this is hyper minutia, but I think this is often a major part of why people feel frustrated, is they have some image in their head and it's not really connected to their ability, to what their art is likely to look like. If you look at that last few pieces of work you've done and you say, it's unlikely I'm going to make some giant leap here. The stuff I'm doing is going to look pretty much like that, but I'm going to try and fold in these new things. I think that's a much more grounded way to look at it, because we can get sort of megalomania often when it comes to looking at different things and getting super excited. And I think that sets our expectation. The last thing that I think you can really do with this, if you are doing it over a long period of time, is really to delve deep into the way that we do progress. And I've noticed this many times. So the basic idea here for the seasoned professional, someone you've been working for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, you can see things that you've created a long time ago. And often what I find is those things are better than what I'm doing now. So for me, I found this really useful because I can look at times where I was doing a few experiments and then for some reason I stopped doing that. Or I just stopped doing something in particular because I was trying to, again, achieve some other goal. And I kind of lost this part of my art. I lost some appeal. So often a good way to sort of explore this is that before I really sort of started building my fundamentals, I'd have ways for drawing faces that were not anatomically accurate, not good, not structural. It was hard for me to even draw them from different angles that way because it was just kind of like just drawing. And I'm just like, how do I draw a face that looks better? And as I got better at drawing structurally, what I kind of found was that I lost that ability. I kind of got better at drawing, but I sort of lost that face that was kind of my style. And trying to go back and recapture that and recapture some of the wisdom that I had in that naivete is really important, because often, again, drawing is a matter of, yes, structure and form and technicalities and foundation, but it's also emotion. And often in the beginning, the way we affect our art is mostly through emotion. That is often the beauty of naive art, or art that doesn't have the best foundation, is that often people find ways to make it look really interesting and nice, and just cool arrangements of shapes and faces that look like they have appeal or whatever it may be. And I've often gone back and said, why can't I do that anymore? I did that. I should be able to do that. What's missing? And then to recommit to some of those ideas. And there's been other times where I've looked at stylistic things that I've done. One of the major things that I did is I spent a lot of time really trying to learn how to use Corel Painter back in the day. And I just kind of got to some point and I just kind of looked back at stuff that I was doing earlier in Photoshop, and I just kind of realized, like, this is better, right? Like I need to stop trying to use Painter, because that was something that felt more painterly. And we'd sort of go on these little tangents where I'd be trying to make stuff look more traditional, more painterly, because in the early days of digital art, everything looked artificial and yucky and sort of average, right? We wanted it to feel more traditional, more organic. So there's lots of these things where I've been able to look back at these folders and say, that was really interesting. And now what I'll often do, because I would have all these crazy ideas for projects and things, I'd be drawing characters and stories. And when I wasn't working on a job, because earlier on, I didn't have a full schedule, right? I didn't have that much work on. I'd have a job here and a job there, and there'd be gaps. And I'd be just coming up with crazy ideas. But, they often weren't that well drawn. But now I can go back to them and say, that was actually an interesting idea. I remember that thing that was going on in my head because I see the image. I remember the story. I remember what was going on in my head, why that was interesting. And I've lost a lot of those things that I was doing then that are actually kind of cool. And I think this is where drawing inspiration from your past self, that sounds really weird, is actually a really interesting little thing to add. So you can think of, if you have like a soup pot of different things that you're trying to sort of boil and bubble and create the future version of you, where it's like, these are the things I'm doing now, these are the projects I'm working on, these are the different elements of art I'm trying to improve. If you just have that like old you, and if you're just beginning your art journey, this will sound ridiculous, but there's often an old version of Tim that had a lot more interesting art than the new version of Tim. And just sort of grabbing that and putting that in the melting pot is probably one of the best ways to get some interesting ideas, because I know all those things are part of me, right? But I kind of lost them. And it's only through having this and easily being able to just sort of go through it that I've been able to, make some of those discoveries and sort of, think about this. And I just think being able to observe this and look at it in that way is immensely useful. So this is the kind of thing that I would do every now and then. I'm not obsessively looking at this, but every now and then if I feel a bit lost, I kind of just scroll through all that stuff and I kind of think about it, and it takes me back to all these different things that I was trying. And again, reminds me of the progress and, some things that I was doing early on that might be better. And then I can go back to it. So you can also see, again, things that I thought would be good turned out not to be good. Yeah, just a really, really useful tool. So those are the ways that you can use it. In the beginning, just comparing one bad drawing to another bad drawing will often tell you that one is better than another. If you're always comparing yourself to the masters, then your drawing is always going to feel as if, look, it's not that good. But once you compare your drawings to each other, spaced in time, naturally you will see the difference, right? So it's the same as color relativity, or a lot of, the way that we sort of perceive people. It's very much the same, right? If you have a whole bunch of tall people, then the shortest one of them is going to be the short person. If you have a whole bunch of short people, then that short person is now the tallest person, right? It's basic stuff, but this is fundamentally how we view things, right? It's all relative. That's how our brain works. And I think, again, all these different ways you can use this will give you insight into your art that is really easy and you can't get any other way. All right, let's do a few takeaways, because although I've given you some pretty simple ways that you can use this, let's just see if we can sum a lot of this up. So fundamentally, I think it's just important to remember that it is always hard for us to tell whether or not we are good as artists. If we look at this from this analytical point of view, it's just hard. The reasons for that I've unpacked, but you always need to remember, if you're having trouble telling whether or not you're getting better, that's normal. That's baseline. I think, secondly, you need a visual way of doing this. Just looking at art is a really good way to start to unpack and look at these things. We're visual people. I can look, as I said, at something I did 15 years ago, some little drawing, and I kind of remember like, oh, that's what I was doing. That's what I was thinking about. This is what I was planning. It's the visual link that sort of transports me in time. Having a visual representation of this and just saying, am I getting better from here to here? As I said, doing these exercises. What's the worst drawing I did in the first week of this year versus the worst drawing that I did in the last week of the year? Again, that's interesting. They're both bad. You'd both think they were the worst things you did, but how do they compare? Comparing that. What about the best drawing that I did here versus the best? Does that make sense? It's a visual comparison, and you will learn a lot about what's improving, what's not improving. It doesn't have to be verbal. We're not talking. This is just visual learning and comparison. Super, super important. And as I said, also, it's important to understand that simple tracking and observation, measuring things, will naturally make them improve in some way, shape, or form. This is one of those weird ways that we tend to function, is just observing it and realizing it, owning up to and looking at where things are going will just help you to make the right decisions day to day. There's not often a lot of reason for this, but again, this is one of those things that has often been played out in different experiments and studies and things. Just observing it will often make sure that sort of number goes in the right direction. So yeah, subconscious visual tracking, highly, highly effective. I think for what we're doing, it's probably going to be way more effective than most other ways of actually figuring any of this out. If you want a simple bro level take on this, if you're not actively tracking something, you're not actually improving. It's just not actually going to be visible. We're too good at adapting to whatever is currently happening for you to just be able to tell that you're improving any other way. If you're not actively tracking, the improvement you're making does not actually exist. All right, how do you actually do this? So I'm going to keep this pretty simple because I think this really is the TLDR here, is you just need a folder full of images somewhere on a computer. This is the simplest way to do it. And I think if you create this as a central collection point, then there's many different ways you could access this. With different image viewing applications, you can create collections of those. You can view them slightly differently, right? So you can just have one sort of basic series of images and using different image viewing applications on different computers, you can make collections of them, and you could organize that as like, okay, here's my just chunk of images, but here is it in linear order. Here's it based on different projects I was working on. Here's my early work, sort of recent work. Here's the, work when I was just doing life drawing, or here's my, you can kind of organize it in any way, shape, or form. But look, we're just dealing with simple JPEGs. You could just duplicate those, make a whole bunch of different files and folders. Whatever's easy. This is the bottom line. It just makes sure that you're not relying on, some internet site to kind of handle all of these. You can have them up there. You can have them in different ways. But look, just a simple folder on your computer that is going to be easy to back up to relatively cheap thumb drive, I think is a super easy way to do this. And from there, if you create that as your kind of core collection, then you can, put some of them on, sync them around and kind of do different things with them. Now, I think it's important here to understand that you also want to collect your bad images. This doesn't need to be just your good ones. You can obviously have, here's my bad ones, here's my good ones. But I've often found that because I've skipped some images that didn't get saved out for me, I didn't actually send them to anyone, they kind of failed, that there's really interesting ideas there that I only get by sort of going through and looking at them. And this is why I sort of bring this up, is I have a way that I normally collect these, but I don't have everything. And what I find is when I find stuff that I haven't seen for a while, I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. Because even though I thought at the time that was terrible, I actually know now what I should do to fix that. And the underlying idea was really important. So keep the bad things and the failures as well for a couple of, I think that let's just say for this one reason, and that is that often what I would find is things that would fail were things where often my ambition outstripped my skill. I had a really good idea, and often as I got halfway through it or a little way through it, I kind of realized I'm not going to be able to pull this off. This is not going well. I'll just shelve that, do something simpler. And then I kind of do that and I'm like, oh, that worked. But it's often those things that we do have ambition that you can come back to later and you can draw a lot of inspiration from. So even though it may seem like it's super frustrating, you just want that thing to go and disappear in a hole and never be seen again, they can actually be really important. So keep the good and the bad. I think that's a really important thing. Save everything, and I think you won't regret it. Right now, you may think, I don't want my rubbishy life drawings, but your rubbishy life drawings are the thing that are going to tell you you've improved. If you only keep the best stuff, you're only seeing half the story. Lastly, if we look at a philosophical, spiritual takeaway, I think there is something here that I think is worth exploring. And I think it's the idea that we are kind of defined by the things we see. As I said, we're very relative, right? As an artist, am I good? Right? If the next image that I create is bad, am I a bad artist? If I fail, am I a bad artist? I think that the more you can create this history of yourself as an artist, the more you create a foundation for who you are through proof, through physical work, through manifestation of your work, it tells you a lot of things. There's often I'll scroll through this and I'll look and be like, wow, I've created a lot of stuff. Half of it I can't show anyone. It's sort of NDA concept artwork. There's a lot of stuff I'm like, I'm never going to be able to show anyone that. That's really disappointing. But again, going back through it, it kind of reminds me of what that foundation is. And I think often it's easy to, you kind of imagine that, okay, if someone has a lot of ability, then they're a good artist. But, the question is like, well, are we good artists? We're only defined by good artists when we can produce good work. If as artists get older, often they lose some of their dexterity and ability. Are they still a good artist because they were a good artist? What does it even mean? I think that often the history you have and the things that you have achieved are just as important as the things that you are going to create, because they remind you of where you are and who you are. And I think without them, often we can be a little bit lost. So this idea of tracking and collecting and collating these, I think is really, really important. And I think without it, it's very easy to kind of lose yourself in the now and again, be very affected by what you're doing. And that does limit your overall creativity. If you know that you have been able to create things in the past that are really good, or that you are improving, it really challenges what you're working on right now, and I think allows you to be more creative. And when you are starting out doing average life drawing and it feels really bad, knowing that you are progressing, that you are challenging, you're experimenting, it takes the pressure off this one drawing. I think this is fundamentally the key thing, is that it takes like the pressure off the thing we're doing, because we understand the greater journey that we're on and the greater body of work that we've created. And even though that may seem like, that's a bit of a cop-out because you're kind of excusing this work being not good by, looking at all this other work that, isn't what you've created right now. I think that often we do fail, we do try things, we do swing and we do miss. And I think just having that confidence of knowing the things that you've created in the past is a really good way to just kind of brush it off a little bit and kind of pick yourself up and, try again. So anyway, I think, for me, again, my sort of outbound sent folder doesn't have every image. And one of the things I'm actually going to do is recommit myself to this. And I'm going to go through, collect all the images that are sort of really old and all the ones that kind of failed. And I'm going to put them there and really sort of think about this. So again, maybe I'll make a follow-up to this one, but I think this idea of looking at ourselves existing in an environment and making sure that you collate and control that environment and make it true, right? It is really what you've created, the good and the bad. I think this just helps you to understand who you are. Anyway, that's all we've got for this particular episode. Hopefully this was interesting. Let me know if you have created a history of your art, whether this has helped you, whether you got any questions about the minutiae of this down below. Other than that, we'll catch you around in the next one.